Who would have expected that COVID-19 would have an effect on DDoS attack frequency? So there's been a lot of activities related to quarantining and the COVID-19 pandemic in the cybersecurity area. And one of those areas is DDoS attacks. So Brian, you're going to share some information about DDoS attacks and what's been happening. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And we've talked about DDoS attacks a bunch of times on this program, but I thought it would be helpful to kind of start out with defining sort of the context around this as to make sure the folks are grounded in the same place that we are. When I refer to a DDoS attack, this is a distributed denial of service attack, we're really talking about large amounts of network traffic that are intended to overwhelm some point in the network capacity. That is to really kind of take somebody out of service. The objective here is to disrupt service for somebody. And, an example might be, and this is actually a commonly misunderstood facet of denial of service attacks. Folks will sometimes, think that they can defend themselves with a firewall. That just plain isn't a practical thing to do. And so if we were to take, for example, and this is just sort of a hypothetical example, a home router, perhaps that home router has capacity, network capacity, or the capacity internally to process about 50 megabits per second of traffic. And I think that's actually, fairly typical for, like a home network service at this point to be up in the tens or perhaps 50 megabits per second of capacity. An attacker might choose to throw about, say maybe a gigabit per second of capacity of traffic at this target to try to overwhelm that device. And invariably, there will be bottlenecks in that process. Their service will be completely down and out. In fact, there's actually the risk that perhaps others in the neighborhood or something are impacted by that attack or something else. And the only way to really protect against something like that is to have a service upstream that really diverts that attack traffic to a scrubbing facility so that they can analyze those packets and determine which ones are allowed to pass through and which ones are not allowed to pass through. I guess the alternative way is to just kind of black hole all of that traffic. They just do throw it all in the bit bucket, in which case the victim, the target, still doesn't get service. They're still a victim of denial of service attack, but it would at least protect others that are around using address spaces nearby or network facilities that are nearby. So, from a network service provider's point of view, first order of business is make sure that others aren't impacted, but ideally you want to be able to get the end user back in the service. So that's what we're talking about is, way too much network traffic for a particular endpoint as we talk about what a denial of service attack is. Now, what might motivate those attacks? Well, there's been some sort of traditional motivations for these attacks. First is, sort of the classic extortion. I'm going to attack you unless you pay me money. And, that's been tried against businesses in the past. It's not very popular, and I think part of the reason it's not very popular for attackers to do this is, first of all, it's sort of a pain in the neck. They have to try to find somebody that's interested in paying them or, interested in protected. It's not really easy to find who administers a website, for example. It's risky for the attacker to take since, they can potentially be attributed to the attack through the extortion communications, the funding transfers that might be, if somebody were to actually pay them, or the attack infrastructure that's being used. So, if you think about doing extortion attacks, don't do it. It's not a good idea. It's illegal and you're likely to get caught. Some nation states have used it for political statements. That is to try to take out, some infrastructure or something, and perhaps even, as a distraction to draw security folks away from, another attack that might be taking place that's much more subtle. So those are sort of the traditional motivations for attacks, and they do occur from time to time. It's not certainly not unheard of. But one of the current and predominant motivations for doing denial of service attacks happens to be related to video gaming. Video gaming's become very competitive. There are folks that make a living playing video games. They get sponsorships and they get, prize money for winning games. And obviously, gamers want to win. And so they're willing to potentially pay to gain an advantage. And, some of them perhaps don't even realize that conducting denial of service attacks, impacting network service is actually illegal. And so there's become a market for gamers to actually, trace the origin of who they're competing against and to conduct an attack and to actually, use that attack to gain an advantage while they're playing a competitive video game. So that's sort of the motivation behind all of this. And it's been reported that the predominant users of DDoS attack for hire services are actually teenagers. Oftentimes, like I said, many may not realize that denial of service attacks are illegal, and they could be actually disrupting many others and perhaps really important business. So it's really important that folks recognize that and aren't conducting denial of service attacks. But it's also important that network service providers that you choose have protection mechanisms in place to be able to protect against these types of attacks. Now, there are multiple examples of DDoS attack for hire services. If you're interested in this, Krebs on Security. This is security news reporting by Brian Krebs. Brian and I have interacted a number of times over the past related to denial of service attacks and other activities. He is an excellent reporter, in-depth on activities that are taking place in this and a number of other security areas. He tends to get behind the scenes and give you some insight into other activities that are going on. He has a number of articles around arrests or activities that have taken place to deter these DDoS for hire services. So we'll provide a link to you with this video so you can go and take a look at that if you're interested. What I wanted to really share with you today is how DDoS attack activity has actually changed over time. And so what we're looking at here is a graph that dates back to January 2019 and extends up to literally this past week, June 11th here in 2020. And what we're looking at is sort of the number of attacks that we have mitigated, that is AT&T services have mitigated, associated with a segment of our network services. And this happens to be a segment that's predominantly used by consumers. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the specific segments here or the quantity of the attacks, but I'll give you sort of a reference point. It's in the hundreds of attacks that we see per week that we recognize and mitigate automatically, completely silent to anybody that is using the network services. And the point here is that our objective is to make sure that the service stays in service and is not disrupted by these attacks. So what's really interesting about this is we have a period of time, and this is fairly typical, where, say, in the summer break, we see, as school gets out, more kids are home. Perhaps in the spring, the weather isn't all that great, and so we see a growth and attack activity. And what we're seeing actually is a tailoring down or a taper down of that activity as the kids go back to school. And some of that might be influenced by things like, they have sports events that are getting them away from playing video games, or they have other outdoor activities that they may be performing that get them away from those video games. We also typically see a spike in activity around the holiday season. This is the, new games come out leading into the holiday retail season. So beginning around November time frame, and then going into just after the first or second week of January, we'll see a spike in activity. And we see that basically represented here by some additional activities taking place around that December, January timeframe. But what's actually, I think, really interesting here is that once the lockdown activities started to take place for COVID-19, we started to see a continuing increase in the amount of activity. And I think it's actually interesting that, as this lockdown activity has occurred, there's been some, I'll say, increase in the lockdown activity, and I think perhaps even increasing frustration or boredom that's taken place, and more kids are playing video games to pass the time as opposed to doing other things that otherwise would be what I would consider to be more healthy. And so what we're seeing here, in fact, is sports events have been canceled. In some cases, parks have been closed. Folks aren't going on vacations or trips and such. And so we really have folks there, and they're schooling to the extent they've been in school. They've been working from home, and so they perhaps have additional time to do these games. And as I said, if they're competitive, looking for some way to get an advantage over the ones they're competing against, and they might resort to a denial of service attack to do that.
That's interesting, Brian. Looking at that chart without the context of gaming that you provided, but with the context of COVID, I would have offered a different explanation. I would think that there are a number of businesses right now who have lost the ability to operate as a brick and mortar store, completely closed down or limited to curbside pickup or other, minimum contact options. And they're going to only be thriving because they can take orders over the internet. Now, if you operate in the extortion space, you've got a whole bunch more people now for whom their website is a critical part of their business that it wasn't before. So if I hadn't known that gaming was a factor here, I would have thought that these are people who are trying to take advantage of businesses who absolutely need their websites to stay up in order to stay in business.
Yeah. Well, actually, Matt, it's actually a very good question, because the next segment here of this will go into that a little bit more to kind of hopefully show that that's perhaps not the case.
Okay.
And I have to say, some of what I'm saying here is a little bit conjecture, but I have supporting evidence all around that really basically supports that this is associated with video gaming and is the primary reason for the changes here. So let's talk about this a little bit further, because I think you actually provided a good segue into the next piece here. First is sort of some corroborating evidence here. That is, this is actually a report from Kaspersky. They do some independent analysis, and I think it's based on predominantly using honeypots, that is to allow devices to get infected and then see what types of activities they're performing. And of those activities, it would include denial of service attack activities. And so what they've done here is compared the first quarter of 2019, that's the green bars, the fourth quarter of 2019, that's the red bars, and the activity in the first quarter of 2020. And predominantly, I'm looking at the bars way over to the right here. That is the maximum duration of smart attacks. And, we see this also in maximum duration of attacks. But what we're seeing here is actually a significant increase in the duration of attacks that they're seeing. And this is, again, they cite associated with these types of activities. I think they actually even attribute it to some extent to the COVID lockdown activity. So the link is provided here so that you can take a little closer look at that report. And similarly, I think it's kind of interesting to see here that we have the distribution of source IP addresses used in these attacks, which is a little bit tangential to this discussion here, but I thought it was really interesting that only about 3.5% of those sources are actually from the United States, and most are actually from many other countries. We have, Brazil. That kind of surprised me. Why Brazil is so high? That's 12%. They have the biggest. Followed by China at 11.5%, and then a couple in the 7 to 8%, that is Egypt and Vietnam respectively, and Iran actually showing up significantly is 5.5%. So that's a little surprising to me, but and an interesting observation itself. And I think perhaps that shows up in some respects in the Internet Weather Report as well. But the last reference point I'll provide here, and I don't have a graphic associated with that, but there certainly is a graphic in the report. But Amazon posted a report for the first quarter of 2020, and they do not show any obvious changes. Now, Amazon's perspective is actually very much a business perspective, not a consumer services net perspective, and they did not show any significant increase in attack activities. That is the frequency of attacks or duration of attacks. What they did see, however, is they reported what they believe to be the largest attack so far at 2.3 terabits per second, which is, that's a pretty formidable attack. If you consider, we were using an example just a little bit ago about, say 50 megas per second, if you can imagine, literally essentially 1 million times larger attack. That's a pretty big attack.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, Brian, this is the biggest reported in like internet history, right? 2.3 terabits.
Biggest reported. There may be others that have not been reported, and sometimes these reports can be a little bit, you have to really kind of dig into it a little bit. I'm inclined to believe what Amazon are reporting because they're not, looking at all kinds of different parts of a network to try to assess the attack size. I think they would have a pretty good perspective. I have seen other reports where I believe they've been double, triple counting, and I've even seen other purported reports where they were relying on the attacker as the source of information about how big the attack was, which is obviously not a reliable source. I don't even think the attacker really knows how big their attacks are. So it is important to kind of take reports like this with a grain of salt, but I'm inclined to believe that Amazon has measured this relatively accurately.
One other detail I would ask about, Brian, I remember when we hit a terabit per second, that was done by kind of a different method of asking like caching servers to dump their cache. But this one is more of the typical reflection attack. Is that correct?
Yeah, there have been a number of, I think predominantly the most, particularly for denial of service attack for higher services, the most economical type of attack for them to use is the type where they look for servers across the internet that are exposed in one way or another and try to use those servers as a means to help reflect or amplify the attacks. And so I think the one that you were referring to was related to, if you correct me if I'm wrong, might have been associated with the network time protocol. Is that the one you're remembering?
Well, I know time servers can be used for amplification. There was also just a caching server attack. I remembered it because it was about a terabit per second. And that was like, wow, we made it to 1 terabit per second.
Yeah, there have been a couple of little things like that that have been identified in the past where a small request, a packet sent with a small request can create a really large response out of the server. For the most part, network time protocol was one of those. I'm forgetting the specific name of it, but I think it was a database technology had another sort of issue like that. Generally, those get corrected relatively quickly and sort of fall out of the foray. The most popular had been used for some time is the use of DNS reflection, because there are certain characteristics of DNS that can support some amplification, and on top of that, there are DNS servers all over the internet. You can't really turn those off, so it makes it more difficult. A lot of good controls have been put into place, and the mitigation platforms are really good at being able to mitigate those types of attacks, but there isn't really a way to kind of make them go away on the internet. A lot of folks will say that what facilitates all of these sort of reflective attacks is the fact that some network service providers will allow spoofed addresses onto the network. That is, you can lie about what address the traffic is coming from, and if you can lie about that, spoof the source address, you can send a request to a server and have the response go to some other address, which ultimately is the target of that attack. So it's that reflection effect, reflecting it off the server toward the target. And but there certainly are network service providers around the world that do not do a good job at preventing spoofing activities. And, it's sort of the solve world hunger on internet type things where you'd like to be able to say all the network service providers prevent spoofing. And I suspect that when we were looking at that pie chart associated with many of the countries that are the originators of attack activity, that you would most likely find that spoofing is, at least in pockets of those areas, possible, more so than in other places. Very good questions. So I think this was an interesting observation, and the activities obviously continuing to go on. Hopefully, as the lockdowns relax, we'll also see a relaxation and people, getting back to normal lives and not depending on video games and DDoS attacks to compete at video games.